The Corps of Cadets at Virginia Tech, the longest standing tradition at this university, has been in continuous session since the university was founded in 1872. And so I'm pleased to talk to you tonight about that history of the Corps. And I'm going to break it into three areas. What I would call the early years from 1851, which is almost 20 years before the university was founded, to what I call the war years from 1898 until 1945, and then the modern day Corps. And I give this presentation to our freshman class every year so they can understand the tradition and the history that they are coming into. But I try to emphasize to them that history is not just in the past, but it continues to evolve. And so I show them a photo. All of you all know the regimental band is called the Highty Tighties. And I show them the 1995 Highty Tighty band photograph of all the cadets standing in front of Burris Hall. And I put little circles around two cadets, Jennifer Daniel and Amanda Rich, who were freshman roommates that year. My first year as a deputy commandant at Virginia Tech in 1998, Jennifer Daniel was my battalion commander. And of the three battalion commanders I had the privilege to work with, she was the best of the three. Tremendous officer. On the first day of the war in 2003, she was a weapons systems officer in the back of an F-14 on a U.S. Navy carrier in the Med. And her old roommate, Amanda Rich, was on another aircraft carrier in the Med. And she was the one responsible for planning and executing all of the Tomahawk cruise missile attacks to take down the enemy air defenses. And on that first day of the war, Amanda Rich launched the missile strikes that took out the enemy air defenses that allowed her old roommate to penetrate into Baghdad to strike her targets. So history is continuing today, and I like to use that as an example. But let's go back to the very beginning. 1851, 19 years before Virginia Tech is founded. In Blacksburg, with one building and 43 students, the Olin Preston Institute is established. And it is not a seminary, but it is a school for men that will give them a Christian education. So that is the first higher education establishment in town, in the town of Blacksburg. One building, 43 students. And they're in business until about the Civil War. And then during the Civil War in 1862, I'm not a big fan of Congress, but our Congress did an amazing thing. In the middle of a war, the Civil War, they passed the Morrill Land Grant Act. And when you think about the strengths of this country, the amazing things about this country's history, I like to look at that action, passing that act in the middle of a war that has had benefits that far outreach what they even imagine today. The Land Grant Act was an act to begin to educate the masses. Back then, you know, the Ivy League colleges were there, and a college education was only available to the rich. Not everyone went to college, nothing like today. And this was the federal government coming up with a way to make this happen. And they went to the states and said, we will give you federal land within your borders for you to sell if you take the proceeds of that sale and establish a college, the Land Grant College. Every state, leading from that act in 1862, every state has a land grant college. There have been subsequent land grant acts, a total of 3, I believe. So there are more than that now, but the original number includes what happened in Virginia. They were to take that money and establish a college that would teach agricultural science, mechanical science, and military science. And so that act passed in 1862. It took Virginia a while. There was a war going on that Virginia was on the losing side of. And then, so it wasn't until 1872 that the state really got serious about where to establish this college. And there were a lot of candidate locations because, you know, if you look at today, if the government's giving out money, there's always someone there to try to take advantage of that. The University of Richmond thought that they should be the location and they should become the land-grant college and get access to that money. And their rationale was they're the state capital. So what better way to administer this new state college than to have it right there? VMI up in Lexington. They said, we already teach military science. We're the military college here. We should get the money and establish the college in Lexington. UVA said, we own some cows. We can teach agriculture. But through some series of circumstances, it was decided that Virginia's land-grant college would be formed on the grounds of the old Preston Olin Institute. And so, on the 1st of October, 1872, the doors were open. They had advertised for months. But, you know, until they opened the doors on the 1st of October, they really didn't know what was going to happen. And sometime during the day, a young man named Addison Caldwell showed up to be the first student here. He walked 26 miles from his Caldwell homestead in Craig County. The Corps of Cadets today, for the last 10 years or so, has recreated his march every year. In the fall, we go out to the Caldwell homestead, which is still occupied, although it's not occupied by the Caldwells anymore. We start at their homestead, and we do a 13-mile hike, go up over Sinking Creek Mountain, past Caldwell Fields, and that ends the first period of freshman training. And then in the spring, we go back to where we left off, and we come back, cross over Brush Mountain, and come back to the Upper Quad, and that ends the freshman training cycle. So we keep the tradition of Addison Caldwell alive. We have a great program where our alumni donate $500 to sponsor a cadet to go on this march, a freshman. When they first, a lady in development first said, why don't we have a sponsor program to do that? And I said, who is going to spend $500 to sponsor a cadet? Well, every year we have alumni sponsor both cadets in both the fall and the spring march, and every year we raise through that sponsorship on the order of $150,000. It's amazing. It's amazing. And the alum gets a photo of the group of all the freshmen who were sponsored and a photo of their freshman next to the Addison Caldwell statue, which is on the Upper Quad. And then they also, the cadet wears a name tag with their name on it during the march, and they get the name tag.
It could be anybody that can sponsor.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Oh, yes. Oh, yes. We'll take anyone. But you get a nice little thank you note from the cadet, and it's a great way to reach out to a young person today. So that first year, 1872, 132 students in the university and the Corps. The first commandant of the Corps Cadets was Brigadier General James H. Lane. General Lane was the youngest general officer in Robert E. Lee's Army of Northern Virginia. He was wounded in the Civil War. He was a student and later an instructor at VMI. And before he came here, he was the commandant of a small military school in North Carolina. He came here. We consider him the father of the Corps. He's very special to the Corps of Cadets, because after the university had been established for a couple of years, some on the faculty wanted to change so that it was not a military school. And General Lane understood that the purpose of the land-grant college was to include that military training. And so at a faculty senate meeting, they had a very in-depth discussion, which ended up with General Lane punching the university president right in the nose. And he didn't stay calm down much longer after that, but the Corps is still here because of him. And things progressed. In 1883, we went from having just infantry companies to our first artillery battery, E-battery. And we still have a little bit of an artillery history now because we have our skipper, our cannon, which we fire at football games and all of our parades. In 1893, the cadet band was formed. Prior to that, whenever they would have a military parade or formation, they would have local musicians from the town would play. But in 1893, band company was formed. And unlike some military schools, the band cadets are not spread across the regiment and just come together to play. Our band is a separate unit that lives together, trains together, and plays together. In 1896, the university underwent the first of many name changes. It was established in 1872 as the Virginia Agricultural and Mechanical College, VAMC, in 1872. In 1896, it became VAMC and PI, Virginia Agricultural and Mechanical College and Polytechnic Institute. When I came here in 1967, the AMC part had already gone, and it was just VPI, Virginia Polytechnic Institute, or Virginia Tech, as we were already known by then. And during my junior year, they changed to the name that we have today, Virginia Polytechnic Institute and State University. VPISU, I never could figure out. Did they never say that? In 1896, we had our first football game against VMI. And this football game, at one point, became known as the Military Classic of the South. We would play this game on neutral ground back in the old days. Today, you know, when we get to Thanksgiving week, the whole week is off. You know, we have Thanksgiving break, everybody goes. Back in the day, we used to get off school on Wednesday, after classes on Wednesday, and we had 2 days. And if you were in the Corps, you didn't go home until after the game. So we stayed on the campus. And on Thursday morning, we went by bus to Roanoke. Back in the day before that, they used to take the Huckleberry, the train, to Roanoke. And we would march through the city. The VMI Corps would march through the city, and we would march into Victory Stadium, and we'd play the game, Military Classic of the South. Well, my junior year, we decided we would have some fun with VMI. Their mascot is a kangaroo. It's not a very awe-inspiring mascot. Ours is a turkey, so I don't have a lot of room. But we decided we would have some fun, and we built a kangaroo out of chicken wire, covered it with paper mache, painted it up in VMI colors. It was pretty sweet. And we have this cannon that I mentioned. And we thought, wouldn't it be great if just before the game started, we brought the kangaroo out and blew it to smithereens. And that was the plan. We got up there and they loaded up the skipper. They unloaded the skipper. They charged it up. We came out of the back of the truck carrying this kangaroo. Well, VMI guys were a lot smarter than I gave them credit for. As soon as they saw that, they knew what was up. We stuck it out in front of the cannon. And about 24 of them charged our position. Yes, they charged the loaded cannon. And they pounced on the kangaroo and they tore it up and they all got a little souvenir and they went back to their stands. And we didn't get to do what we wanted to do. But if a Virginia Tech cadet is anything, he is persistent. So the next year, we decided we'd try again. Only we built 2 kangaroos this year. And the first one we made a little modification to. It was, we are an agricultural college. So we went to the barns. And we packed one with about 120 pounds of manure. And we brought it to the stadium. And we brought the skipper out, and we charged it up. And we took out, it took us 3 people to get this one off the truck. Put it out in front, and sure enough, here they came again. And they pounced on it. They were not happy. They were not happy. That was a very unique game because that day in Roanoke, on one side of the field there was the blue cadet section where Virginia Tech sat. And on the other side of the field there was the gray cadet section where VMI sat and a little brown cadet section where the Raiders sat. And then we brought the second one out and we blew it to smithereens. Now I'll take you into what I call the war years. 1898, Spanish-American War, the Philippine Insurrection. The entire regiment volunteered to go on active duty as part of the Virginia military establishment to go fight the war. The governor said, no, your college students stay in college. And the regiment said, okay, except for the band. The band has always been their own unit, and so they enlisted as a band, and were on their way. They got as far as Florida. Were on their way to Cuba when the war ended. The next year, during the Philippine Insurrection, one of our alumni was the first of our alumni to win the Medal of Honor. And that was Antoine Gaugeot, who was originally in class of '01, but he enlisted in the Spanish-American War. During the Philippine Insurrection, his unit was under fire across a raging river from the enemy. And he and another guy forded the swollen river, stole an enemy canoe, and brought it back, and allowed them to get enough people across to outflank the enemy. And he received the Medal of Honor for that. His brother, Julian Gaugeot, older brother, class of 1893, he was a career military man. And it stuck in his gut that his brother had this award and he didn't. He said he wore it for a watch fob, the damn civilian. And he said he had to get himself one of these. And he was one of the few Medal of Honor recipients in our history who got it for peacekeeping actions. During a border skirmish in the south of Arizona, Mexican bandits were fighting Mexican regulars just across the border, and their fire was coming into an American town and injured some folks, and he rode his horse out between the two forces and got them, extracted the Mexican regulars and their prisoners safely to the American side. They are one of the few brothers to have ever won that award, and the only brothers who won that award in 2 separate wars. World War I was the next big event, and that was a big change here on campus. In 1917, ROTC came to campus, the Reserve Officer Training Corps. This was the first time that there was a federal military training established on the campus. And it was started with infantry, and in 1919, coastal artillery for the Army was also established here. And then during World War I, VPI made significant contributions to the war effort. We had 2,155 alumni in the service during that war. We lost 26 of our alumni, and we had 8 of them receive the Distinguished Service Cross or the Navy Cross, which is the second highest award for valor that you can get. And because of that record, the number of people who served and the number of people who won those high awards, the Congress declared in legislation that VPI was a distinguished college. We had another Medal of Honor recipient in that conflict, Earl Gregory, class of 1923. He hadn't even come to college yet. And in the Argonne Forest in 1918, when his unit was under enemy fire, he said, "I will get them." And he single-handedly captured an enemy machine gun and then went on to capture a mountain howitzer and 19 prisoners. He then came to Virginia Tech and was a company commander his senior year, was voted the most popular cadet at the college, and was his class president. Not bad. After the war, the university continued to evolve. In 1921, women were admitted for the first time as civilians. First, they had to live downtown, and then later, Hillcrest Dormitory was created to be strictly for female students, and the cadets called it the skirt barn. In 1922, the university was continuing to expand, and a 2nd Battalion was formed. And the next year, a major change occurred. In 1923, the membership in the Corps of Cadets was made optional after the first 2 years. And you could transfer in from somewhere. If you came in as a transfer student, you would not have to be in the Corps. So that was the first change to the 4-year military school requirement. In 1927, it continued to expand, and we stood up a 3rd Cadet Battalion. And in 1939, on the eve of World War II, the growth had gone to a 4th Battalion. And then, of course, in 1941, we went to war. Immediately after the war started, we increased enrollment again, and we stood up a 3rd Battalion, but we changed how we went to college. We went into a 12-month-a-year academic session. Easley Smith, he remembers that well. He was class of 45. So we were in quarters back then. Fall, winter, and spring quarters. And Easley came in the fall quarter of 1941. And on December 7th, at the end of the quarter, the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor. And so the university went into a 12-month-a-year education system where everyone went fall, winter, spring, and summer quarters. Seniors graduated early. Sophomores and freshmen over 18 were inducted into the Army. This actually became an Army training post. The Corps, the non-Army, the cadet students, eventually was reduced to 300 who were not able to do military service. During the Second World War, we had over 7,000 alumni in the service of their country. We lost 323 dead. They're all listed on our war memorial pylons. And our alumni were awarded the Distinguished Service Cross or Navy Cross a total of 9 times. And during that conflict, we had 3 additional alumni who were awarded the highest award for valor, the Medal of Honor. The first was Herbert J. Thomas, United States Marine Corps, in November of 1943 in the Solomon Islands, leading his platoon under attack by Japanese. A hand grenade fell within his unit, and he threw himself on it to save the lives of his men. The second one was Jimmy Monteith, class of 1941. Jimmy Monteith was from Richmond, and he was an Army first lieutenant at the first day of the Normandy invasion, June 6, 1944, on Omaha Beach. Through a long day of continuous combat, including after they had established a presence beyond the beach, coming back to the beach to lead 2 tanks through a minefield to get them to where they could support them. He was killed in a German counterattack on that day. And the final one was Robert E. Moyer, class of 1944, who left as Easley Smith did during his time here, left school. He was a B-17 navigator in Europe, 8th Air Force. And on the 2nd of November 1944, on a mission against Meersburg, Germany. His aircraft was damaged by enemy anti-aircraft fire, and he received grievous wounds. And because of his aircraft was damaged, it had to fall out of formation and lost that protection of those other defensive guns and all those aircraft around them. So they were on their own to try to get back to England. And he laid on the floor of that cockpit, below zero temperatures, his life bleeding out of him. And he refused morphine, refused medication so that he could stay alert and he could see the maps so he could get his crew home. And when he got the aircraft back to the North Sea, he then accepted medical treatment, but he died 30 minutes after they landed. We have 3 dorms, Thomas, Monteith, and Fermoyer, on the Upper Quad that were built in 1949 and named for those 3. After the war, the university again changed. This huge influx of people on the GI Bill, people who had served, came to campus. And it was decided that if you served in the military during World War II and you came to campus, you did not have to be in the Corps. Certainly understandable. So in 1946, for the first time in the university's history, civilian students outnumbered cadets. And it stayed that way for about 3 or 4 years until that group graduated out. Also in 1946, Air Force ROTC, at the time was Army Air Force ROTC, came to campus. And then in 1947, the Air Force was established as its own separate service, and Air Force ROTC was established here. And the Corps eventually expanded back to 4 battalions. Although, because there were so many people here under the GI Bill, they didn't have housing for everybody, so they actually put 1 battalion over at the RAD Tech campus, which was the arsenal over in Radford. The Korean War followed shortly after, and then in that war just under 2,000 of our alumni served, and 30 were lost, including our 7th Medal of Honor recipient, Richard Thomas Shea, class of 1948. In the Battle of Pork Chop Hill in Korea, a 3-day battle, he was wounded on day 2 and refused to be evacuated, to stay with his men, and was last seen alive in hand-to-hand combat with the communist forces, and died that day. In 1952, for the first time ever, the commandant of cadets was a retired general officer. General Stan Musser is with us tonight. He was the commandant from 88 to 98? 89 to 99. So in 1952, for the first time, a retired general officer came here, and Stan has been in that progression. Prior to that, it was the senior ranking military officer on campus. And now I'll talk a little bit about the modern Corps. In 1958, the university and the Corps of Cadets had its first African American graduate, Charlie Yates. He recently passed away. And we'll have a memorial service for him on the 5th of November. Dr. Yates came and talked to the Corps about 6 years ago, and when I talked to the freshmen, I emphasized his talk. It was a remarkable talk. He said, he looked out to the cadets and he said, how many of you, raise your hand, if you had your offer of admissions delivered to you by the president of the university? And nobody raised their hand. And Dr. Yates said, the president of the university and the director of admissions came to my house and gave me the offer of admission, and then said, but you won't live on campus. We've already made arrangements with a local family for you to live. Because that's how our country was then. There was not an ounce of bitterness in Dr. Yates. I think he understood that somebody had to go first. Somebody had to blaze the trail for everyone else to benefit from. And I was truly impressed by that. In 1964, the Corps changed again. The university changed. Dr. Hahn was the president. And in 1964, he changed what had been in effect since 1923. In 1923, it was changed to where the Corps was optional after the first 2 years. In 1964, it was made optional, period. Because Dr. Hahn had a vision to make Virginia Tech the public university in the state of Virginia. And so the Corps changed. The Corps changed because it became strictly voluntary. When I came here in 1967, there were roughly 1,100 cadets. And there were 9,000 students. And when I graduated 4 years later, there were 700 cadets. And the university had 12,000 students. So it had grown by a third in just that 4-year period. A huge period of expansion. And the Corps changed. And there was a lot of angst amongst alumni because they thought the Corps would go away, would die, but it has not. The Vietnam War came. We had the addition of 2 combat crosses, 1 Navy Cross, 1 Air Force Cross. And at the end of that period, towards the end of that period, we have what I call the Modern Corps. In 1970, it was a period of great unrest in this country. In 1970 at Kent State, they had 4 students killed by the National Guard during the demonstration. And outside agitators, for lack of a better word, came to campus to try to disrupt the education process here. And they came in during a 1-week period. And they occupied a student records building one night and tried to set fire to some records. They were asked to leave, and they did. But one night, later on that week, they occupied Williams Hall. And they barricaded themselves in there, 108 of them, the Blacksburg 108. That was back in the day of the Chicago 7. We had the Blacksburg 108. They barricaded themselves in there. And boy, there were a lot of, it was a hectic, it was an intense week, a lot of stuff going on. There was a humongous state police presence here. 1/3 of the Virginia State Police was billeted in Blacksburg and Christiansburg. My wife and I were dating at the time, and we sat out in the drill field one day and counted, in every 8th car going around the drill field was a state police car. In the morning after they occupied Williams Hall, President Hahn, they pulled up a big Mayflower moving van to the back area of Williams Hall. And Dr. Hahn had a bullhorn, and he walked around and he said, "If you'll come out now, we won't take any action against you. But if you don't come out, we're going to expel you." Now, not everybody in there was a student, but nobody came out. So they backed the truck up to the back of Williams Hall, and they put these big chains from the back of the truck through the door handles. And they just pulled out and yanked off the doors. Everybody had been kind of hunkered down behind the doors, and as soon as the doors were pulled off, they scattered. And the police let go the dogs. I have never seen people climb trees so fast in my life. In 1973, the Corps Cadets became the first military college to admit women. We did that 3 years before the Federal Service Academies did. They did that in 1976. We first brought women in in a separate unit. They lived separate, and they had their own unit, L Squadron. And they had their own uniform, which looked different than the regular cadet uniform. In 1979, L Squadron was disbanded so that the women were integrated into the units, but only for training, not for lodging. They still lived separately. And that lasted until 1991, when General Musser was the commandant. I'm told that the women came and said, we don't want to be separate. We want to really be integrated. And so they were fully integrated in the Corps of Cadets and still are today. And we are the only fully gender integrated dorms on campus. There are mixed gender dorms in the civilian realm, but they may be by floors, male one floor, female the other floor, or by wings. But in the Corps of Cadets, you can have 2 women living next door to 2 men, living next door to 2 women. Fully gender integrated. And it works surprisingly well. Because of the bonding process that you go through in that Corps experience, it's not a gender thing as much as it's a brother and sister thing. In 1983, Navy ROTC came to campus for the first time. Prior to that, it had just been Army, and then, as I said, in 46, 47, Air Force. The Navy came in 1983. In 1991, the Corps became fully co-ed, as I said. Now, I had told you that the big change occurred in '64, and we had, as the Cadet Corps got smaller, we brought down the number of units. We used to have 16 line companies, and that's what we had when I started my freshman year, but the senior year we collapsed down to 8 because we got smaller. But the Corps was beginning to grow again. It had atrophied, and I believe it was likely that the Corps was going to be just allowed to die in the late 80s, mid 90s. But at that time, a very strong group of alumni and an aware and energetic staff began to turn things around. And through alumni support, in the beginning of an endowment, we established a scholarship that allowed us to begin to attract more students and better students. And that scholarship program has evolved from a small scholarship program in 1995. I manage that program today, and this year we will pay out $1.5 million in scholarships to our cadets. And that allowed the Corps to begin to expand. And in 1998, we stood up a 3rd Battalion and added a couple of companies. And that was, coincidentally, that was the year I retired from the Air Force. And I was honored and privileged to become the Deputy Commandant to that 3rd Battalion, where I had that cadet, Jen Daniel, that I talked about before. And the Corps has remained at that level since then, but our size has continued to grow. When I first came here in 1994, when I came back to campus, the Corps of Cadets had 406 cadets in it. For the last 8 years, we've been over 700. And this year, we started at 857, the largest Corps of Cadets since 1969. And boy, they're good kids. They're good kids, and I urge any of you to come on up to the quad, say hello to a cadet. Ask them where they're from, ask them what they're doing, and you'll be impressed. You'll be impressed, and it's a great job for me because I get to work with them on a regular basis, and it will give you faith in your country to know that there are still young men and women who are ready to do the hard things and do the right things because they're the right things to do. I don't want to stop without talking about, mentioning again our Heidi-Tidies. We owe them a lot. In 1936, they were given their white cord by the president of the university in honor of them going on active duty during the Spanish-American War. They still wear that cord today. And one of those interesting things, if you know anything about military citation cords, there's a braided loop and then a couple of unbraided loops. And the braided loop goes under your arm. Well, when they were presented that by the president of the university, his wife pinned it on him, and she pinned it on him backwards so that the unbraided loop was on the outside, and they wear it that way today. They won the presidential inaugural parade in 1953, 1957, and 1961 as the best parade unit. In 1961, they decided they weren't going to make it competitive anymore, and they retired the trophy here. And if you go to the Virginia Tech Museum at the Alumni Center, you'll see that retired trophy. And the Heighty-Tighties were also special to us because in 1975, they became the first organized cadet alumni presence. And last weekend at the football game, the Heighty-Tighty alumni band marched. And I love seeing that every year, and that's become just a wonderful tradition. Now that kind of gets us up to today, but I want to mention a few people that I want to remember. The first one I remember is a guy named Harry Temple, class of 1934. Harry Temple died 4 or 5 years ago. Wonderful guy, a mentor to me. He wrote a 6-volume history of the university, which is really the history of the Corps of Cadets, from 1872 until his graduation year, 1934. Wonderful, wonderful man. And his work is the research that I did for this presentation. Great story for Harry. In his senior year, in honor of his class is a big thing to cadets. You can ask any cadet on the upper quad today what class Colonel Roszak was in, and he'll know I was in the class of 71. And when they passed me, they yell their class number at me. Class is a big thing. It was a big thing back then, too. During his senior year, Harry Temple, one night, got out his rifle and fired it out of his dorm window 34 times in honor of his class. The commandant awarded him 74 demerits for this, at a time when 75 demerits meant expulsion. And for the rest of his senior year, his buddies stayed around him and made sure he never got another demerit. So I remember Harry Temple every time I give this presentation. The other people I want to remember are the people that we've added names, whose names we've added to the War Memorial. The first was a Army Lieutenant Jeffrey Kaler, class of 2001. Jeffrey was in the fraternity that I was the advisor for. He was a good kid. The last time I saw Jeffrey, I was doing rounds, and I was walking through the dorm about 2 a.m. And it was 3 weeks from graduation. And I walked past Jeffrey's dorm room, and his dorm was open, and he was sitting there studying at 2 o'clock in the morning. With graduation that far, only 3 weeks away, he was focused. He was focused. He lost his life on the 7th of April, 2003, in the initial invasion of Iraq. The next spring, in the spring of 2004, we held the first of what we call a gunfighter panel. And this is an event that we hold every semester since the spring of 2004, where we bring in usually 3 of our alumni who've been in combat. We bring them back to talk to our cadets and tell them a little bit about their experiences and tell them what they need to be thinking about right now, and telling them that the little things that they don't understand right now that they're doing, they may not understand why, are there for a purpose. And they really are getting them ready. That first gunfighter panel, we had 4 guys there, and there was a guy named Tim Price. Tim Price and his classmate, Jeremy Kerfoot, who had been the drum major in the band. They were also class of 2001, and they were Jeff Kaler's classmates. And before they talked to us that Thursday afternoon, they went down to the War Memorial and looked at their classmate's name engraved there and paid their respects. And that day, when Tim Price talked to us, he spoke with what I considered a huge amount of wisdom for a young man of his age. He said, when you graduate, whether you go on active duty or whether you're in a company or you're in business, you're going to face a circumstance that you may not think that you're properly prepared for. But you will be prepared because you are a Virginia Tech cadet. If you remember the values on the pylons, duty, honor, leadership, brotherhood, loyalty, service, sacrifice, and nut prosum. If you remember those values and keep them in your heart, you will know the right thing to do. Really, an amazing statement from a young guy. He'd already been back from his first tour. 2 months later, he was asked to go back to fix a leadership problem in a unit in Iraq. And on September 7th of 2004, he was killed by a sniper in Baghdad. At his funeral on the Eastern Shore, his platoon sergeant spoke eloquently. With 2 general officers there from West Point, he talked about what a leader Tim Price was, how he cared for his people, how he did what his people needed him to do for them. And he said, I've talked about Lieutenant Price to my contemporaries, and I have heard from several of my contemporaries that they also knew a young leader who was just like that. And that young leader's name was Jeffrey Stewart, and he was a graduate of the Virginia Tech Corps of Cadets too. That sergeant said, you can keep your West Pointers. Bring me more leaders from the Virginia Tech Corps of Cadets. In September of 2005, Nick Brantley, also a class of 2001, lost his life flying a helicopter on night operations off the coast of Carolina, getting ready to go to combat. My last year as deputy commandant, I had 4 commanders working for me. One of them was a company commander named Tim Price, and the battalion commander was Nick Brantley. And when I talk about Nick, I show a photo of a Hokie bird statue that we have in Schultz Hall. You remember the Hokie birds that were all over town? This one was painted in a cadet uniform, and it was purchased by the classmates, family, and friends of Nick Brantley. And on the back of the Hokie bird, on his feathers, there are symbols that come from Nick's life. First, he wears the cadet lieutenant colonel rank because that's what Nick was. On his back, there's the flag of the state flag of Virginia where he went to school, the state flag of North Carolina because he came from Ahoskie, North Carolina. He was an avid fisherman, and there's a fish. His helicopter's on there. The flaming VT that is done at the homecoming pep rally is carried by the hotel company, and he was a freshman in the hotel company. I show him and explain all that because his mom told me a year after he died that her biggest fear was that they would forget. People here would forget who Nick Brantley was. And I pledged to her that they'll never forget Nick Brantley. And so we give that lesson of what the symbolism of that statue to this day to our freshman class. Last October 26th, another 2001 graduate, Seth Mitchell, was lost flying his helicopter in Afghanistan. And we conducted a pylon ceremony last April with his mother and father and brother here. And 3 days after that, we lost Ensign Zachary Eckhart, who we just honored with a moment of silence at Saturday's football game. And next April, we will have another pylon ceremony where we will unveil his engraved name in the war memorial with his wife and her parents and his parents present. The history of the Corps of Cadets at Virginia Tech is not over. It continues to evolve. We are an integral part of this university and a unique part. And it's just one element of what makes Virginia Tech special and unique. that it has this large, full-time military school embedded within a large cosmopolitan research university. The longest-standing tradition at Virginia Tech is alive and well, and you can bet that I'm proud to be associated with it. I thank you very much for your attention.